What's going on, everybody? Welcome to today's video where we're going to be diving into some new Forgotten Realms budget decks. This is that favorite time, I think, of every set that I do enjoy. It's where we kind of, have that moment where we kind of use our creative juices, kind of see what new cards we got with the release of the new packs, and we get to experiment around with the cards and kind of see what we can build. And in today's video, I came up with a couple of, new budget decks that you could try out utilizing some of the new mechanics that come from Strixhaven. Yes, in some of the decks, there are some cards that are from other sets, but these decks are tuned to actually be pretty decently playable in the 2022 standard queue, as we're not going to be utilizing any of the older cards from the older sets, because a lot of you are, I know, newer players to the game, or players who are looking forward to playing in a different meta. So I decided to go ahead and build decks that are going to be hopefully be able to be not just played for this specific queue, and also be played throughout the fall and into next year. So with that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Lets me know you guys like these style of videos. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It puts a +1 +1 counter on the channel, which definitely helps out a lot. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just talk about it. All right, so the first deck up is an interesting deck that I kind of came up with. It's kind of like an all go in kind of thing, and I was trying to figure out like what kind of deck could synergize pretty well with the new mechanic called Pack Tactics. If you haven't seen it and any of the cards are played with it yet, essentially if we can attack with a power 6 or more during one of our combats, we get some sort of trigger. Our Targnar, for example, gives all our attacking creatures +1/+0 into end of turn. At the same time too, we can also tap 4 and also double its power and toughness into end of turn, which essentially allows us to get more power in attacking our opponent's face, so it allows us to get a little bit more aggressive. But the overall idea here is to play a bunch of creatures in the deck that I do think amp up our overall power levels. Some of the creatures do gain triggers from landfall. We do have some cards that take benefit of landfall, therefore that's why we are playing the Evolving Wilds, because come rotation, Fable Passage does rotate out, and as of right now, it's the only fetch land that will be technically playable in standard come September. So with that being said, I mean, overall the deck is pretty interesting in what it's trying to do. We are trying to pump out some lands, also trying to pump out some creatures so we can actually activate our Pack Tactics, while at the same time too utilizing one of the new other cards in the set called one of the class enchantments, which essentially here is one, when we initially play it, we get a 2/2 green wolf. If we level it up to level 2, we get to, whenever we attack, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And at level 3, if we want to, we can level it all the way up, and we can look at the top card at any time, and we may cast creature spells from the top of our library. So essentially, hopefully getting more aggressive, getting more wide against our opponent to hopefully trigger this Pack Tactics. But other than that, I mean, overall the deck is pretty straightforward. We are playing Snow Mana just because I do think come rotation, Frostbite is probably the best removal spell for 1 mana. So the benefit of having multiple snow lands out is the ability to ping one of our opponent's creatures and or planeswalkers for that 3 damage. Worst case, you do ping it at least for 2, but overall pretty good card right then and there. So going through the rest of the list, we actually start off with our Occom Hellhound. It's a 1 mana 0/1 that whenever we play a land, it gets +2/+2 to end of turn. So definitely a pretty decent one dropped into a land on turn 2, attacking it for 2 at least, if not more, depending on what else we do play. So overall pretty decent card, though it is kind of dependent on if we are able to keep on playing lands. So at some point, sometimes if you don't draw lands, you do get stuck with a 0/1 that really does nothing. And we already kind of went over it. The Frostbite as a good spot removal spell. It synergizes very well, it being 1 mana, possibly paying something for 3 damage if we have 3 or more snow permanents. If not, it's only 2 damage. Then also playing on that snow kind of style, we are also playing Blizzard Brawl. We get to choose target creature we control and choose target creature we don't control. If we control 3 or more snow permanents, those creatures fight each other, and our creature gains indestructible. Our creature gains +1/+0 and indestructible, and then these creatures fight each other. So I guess kind of set it out of order, but essentially it's a fight spell for 1 mana at sorcery speed, so overall not too bad. Then we're also playing 2 copies of Snakeskin Veil in here. Not more so, it's more so as like a hexproof, kind of thing. If our opponent decides to target our creature with something, we can always put a +1/+1 counter on it at the same time too. Get that hexproof so they can't actually further target with more spells. So just overall kind of like a little bit of protection kind of thing. I'm not 100% sure if I'm sold on this in some of the games. Sometimes it feels good, sometimes it doesn't feel as good. So right now in the current build, I'm not really sure if this is something that I would keep or something I would eventually cut as I play more games. But I do think it's okay at 2 copies just to kind of have. As our first rare in the deck, we are playing the new Jelly card. It's Oakward Jelly. It's a green mana and X. It's an ooze creature that with trample, and when it enters battlefield, it enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. So it's kind of like the new Snake's Stonecoil Serpent kind of thing. But this is actually a pretty interesting card here. So it enters with those X +1/+1 counters on it. It has this ability called Split. Whenever it dies, I've had 2 or more +1/+1 counters. Create a token that's a copy at the beginning of our next end step. the token enters the battlefield have as many +1/+1 counters on it rounded down. So if we do play for at least 3 mana, it comes out as a 2/2. We do get a 1/1 jelly out of it. But the thing is, that's actually pretty interesting out of it. If we are able to play a much bigger one, we can actually create jellies that replace jellies as long as they stay big enough. And this is where I kind of do feel like Snakeskin Veil is okay. So if we do create only a 2/2 jelly that ends up dying, we can always put another +1/+1 counter on it that will actually have the same trigger on it again, because the copy is a copy of this exact card. Yeah, at the same time too, I don't know if you've seen any other gameplay. It is not a true token. It still has a casting cost, so it can be targeted by spells like Divide by Zero, which technically don't normally counter our target tokens, but because it's a copy of this card, it actually keeps the casting cost. That is the one drawback to it. Other than that, it's a pretty interesting card that I do think is pretty decent in this build, though I do think it's kind of like that big mana dump thing. We're not really sure what to use our mana on. We can always cast a big jelly that it just causes mayhem for our opponent to have to deal with. So in the idea here, we're also playing landfall. We want to have some sort of ramp. So we have emergent sequence here, which actually synergizes pretty well with us trying to ramp other cards onto the battlefield. If you play this on like turn 3, after you play maybe an Evolving Wilds into play, crack the Evolving Wilds, search your library for another card, then play this. 1, we're ramping up at the 4 mana, which is pretty decent. 2, this actually comes in as a 3/3 elemental land, our fractal land that is into play tap, which is also pretty good. And then we actually ramp up as well. So it gets us a little bit more aggressive for only 2 mana. So overall, not too bad of a card. We do have other ways of actually getting more lands onto the battlefield, which we then can follow up with this card and get a much bigger land. The one downfall of the land is now a creature, so it can be targeted by spells. But overall, pretty interesting card that kind of synchronizes pretty well with this whole landfall ability. Then we got the Null Hunter. It's another interesting card here. It's a common. It's a 2/2 for 2. It has the ability called Pack Tactics, like the other card in the deck. And whenever it attacks, if we attack creatures with power total or 6 or greater this combat, we have to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it can grow if we can get a decent sized board out on the battlefield. So overall, pretty decent card for being a common at 2 mana. It can get bigger. Decent value, though I would say until you really get that power out on the battlefield, sometimes it can fall a little bit flat, just because if you're not attacking and playing defensive, it doesn't really have any other abilities other than that. And then we have the class spell, which is the Ranger spell. I kind of already went over this, but I'll go over it one more time. 2 mana, you become a Ranger essentially. You get a 2/2 green wolf out of it. For two mana to level it up, you can, whenever we attack, we have to put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. And for 4 mana, we can level it to level 3. We may look at the top card of any library at any time. We cast that creature spell from the top of your library. So it's definitely a pretty good card in that sense. I do like the level 2 ability, just because giving creatures a +1/+1 counter is very good, especially for like getting in the situation where we're not drawing too many lands. You can put lands counters on creatures that are, very dependent on landfall. So overall, pretty decent ability there. The one thing I will say, just in case you're unaware, you actually have to level up through the various levels in order to get it to the max level. So you do have to get it to level 2 and then to level 3. You just can't play the 4 mana and get it to level 3 automatically. You do have to get it through the middle level as well. So if you do play other classes, it's the same thing when it comes to those classes as well, though the mana cost is maybe different. Continuing on our landfall kind of creature, we are playing Brushfire Elemental. It's a 2 mana, red and a green, 1/1 with haste, and it can't be blocked by creatures of power 2 or less. So it creates a very tough situation, especially when you get like a decent play, like when you crack like an Evolving Wilds, and playing the Evolving Wilds, it can become a 5/5 that's unblockable by little creatures. And the overall ability, just like the Hellhound, it gets +2/+2 every time we play a land onto the battlefield. And the one benefit is it does have haste. Then we have the Targnar. It's a Demon Fang Null. It's another red and a green to play. It's a 2/2 with Pack Tactics. If we attack with creatures with power 6 or more, all our creatures get +1/+0 into turn, or all our attacking creatures get +1/+0 into end of turn. And then we can also pay 4 mana and double its power and toughness. So you can actually let the trigger go, get that additional +1/+0, and then actually double it after that, and then make it a 6/4 instead of a I guess a 4/4 plus an 8/8, or our 4/4 then plus the +1/+0, make it a 5/5. So you do get the additional +1 if you do it that way, if that's a play that comes. But overall, pretty decent card. It is legendary, so that's why we're only playing 3 up, because we want to draw it, but we don't want to always draw it, just because if we already have one out, we really can't play a second one unless we destroy the one that's already on the battlefield. Because we're in the world of ramping, we do also play Vastwood Surge. It's an interesting, ramp spell. It is a sorcery for 4 mana. We get to search our library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. If this spell was kicked, we get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature we control. This is kind of more meant as like a decent card that kind of gets some two lands on the battlefield for a decent mana cost. You know, if we do have the extra mana open, we can always kick it to get the +1/+1 counters, but it's not necessary. I do just think it's a pretty decent 4 mana ramp spell, just post rotation. There's not too many in this sense that get 2 lands for the price of 4, so I do think it's an overall pretty decent spell. Though I'm sure there's other options you can get that if you just want to get the 1 land out in general. And then because I feel like if we create a lot of mana, we need some stuff to play on the top end. So because we are playing budget, I don't want to throw too many rares in, and that's why we are playing some uncommons up in the top end. But we have the purple worm. It's just an 8/7 worm with ward 2. And the spell costs 2 less to cast if a creature died this turn. So it's an interesting worm that I'm just messing around with. I'm not really sure if it's really that great. I do feel like it's more of a limited card just because it's more of a pain in the butt and limited to probably get rid of. Though I do think it's a pretty decent card for the top end just to have something pretty large that if we do swing in, we do have something that's pretty big that everyone has to deal with. Then we also have Bookworm. It's an 8 mana 7/7, and it's just battlefield to gain 3 life. We get to draw a card, and then we can always return it from our graveyard to our library for the 3rd from the top if we pay the 3 mana. So just an overall interesting card here. I will say this is the one I think needs a little bit more tweaking, just in the sense of this general play. It sometimes works, but then sometimes like the top end does sometimes feel a little bit clunky. So it is one of those things I do think if you want, you can always think of other ways that you may want to adjust the deck in how you want to. Like I said, with most of my budget decks, I don't play more than 4 rares. So if you want to add in more rares, if you've acquired more Forgotten Realm cards, I do think that definitely will help, just because it will help with the consistency of the deck. But overall, the deck is pretty decent to get started out in if this is something you want to try out with that aggro style deck. And the mana base is 9 mountains, 11 forests, and 4 evolve wilds, just because we need the fetches to, you know, help with the landfall. So this next deck up on the list is actually a pretty fun one in what it's trying to do. I call it Is It Roll, just for our Prismari Roll, whatever you want to call it, because it's blue-red. It's a deck that takes use of the new mechanic, or the new roll mechanic, and essentially we get benefits of us rolling. We play various creatures in the deck, like Pixie Guide, which helps us get additional rolls and we take the higher rolls, which is definitely very good if we want to get the better effect of the rolls. We also play Fey Wild Trickster, which is one of those things whenever we roll 1 or more dice, we get to create a 1/1 blue fairy dragon creature token with flying, so a creature that produces tokens, which is also very good. And overall, well, the way the deck is trying to do, we're trying to build up in the early game with the rolls to try to, you know, get additional rolls, trying to get some tokens on the battlefield to maybe use as chumps. We do play some various things that also help us get additional rolls or take benefit of us rolling multiple times. So the first card I do play in the deck is the 1 mana Barbarian class. It's an uncommon class card. If we roll 1 or more dice, instead of roll that many dice +1 and ignore the lowest roll. So just essentially another thing that gives us additional dice roll. For 2 mana, we can level it up to level 2. Whenever we roll 1 or more dice, target creature we control gets +2/+0 until end of turn and gains menace. And then for 3 mana, we get to level 3. It just gives all our creatures we control half haste, so they come into the battlefield, they can immediately attack if we do get a pretty decent sized battlefield of creatures. Then we also play 3 copies of Frostbite. Yet again, in spot removal, the goal here is we're trying to overroll our opponent, get very wide on them. So it's kind of one of those things, in case our opponent is playing something that's pesky, get it out of the way. We can either shock it for 2 mana or possibly shock it for 3. We are playing snow mana, so overall pretty decent spot removal card. Kind of already went over the Pixie Guide, but it's a 2 mana 1/3 flyer with granted an advantage if we would roll 1 or more dice. Instead, roll that many dice +1 and ignore the lowest roll. So it's a 1/3, which is a pretty decent blocker, and on top of it, getting that bonus roll is definitely beneficial for us in this deck. Then we have the Goblin Morningstar. It's a 2 mana equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has trample, and we can equip it for 1 colorless and a red. And when it enters the battlefield, we get to roll a d20. Rolls 1 through 9, we get a 1/1 red goblin creature token, and then rolls 10 through 20, we get a 1/1 goblin creature token, and then we get to attach this equipment to it, so we get a 2/1 essentially for 2 mana and an equipment, which overall is pretty decent. Just a little bit of like a 2-drop filler, so I thought it was something that we could add in maybe in the late game if we need to get through. We can always give it to a creature and give that additional +1/+0 if we want to move the equipment. We already went over the Failed Wild Trickster, but I'll go over it again. It's a 3 mana 2/2, and whenever we roll 1 or more dice, we get a 1/1 blue dragon creature token out of it with flying, which overall pretty decent chump blocker. In the late game, we can always swing in and get that additional damage with all these tokens we're creating, as long as we continue to roll. Then the next card we have is Contact Other Planes, a 4 mana instant spell. We get to roll a d20. Rolls 1 through 9, we draw 2 cards. Rolls 10 through 19, we just scry 2 and then draw 2 cards. And our 20s, we get to scry 3 and then draw 3 cards. So overall, pretty decent card for what it's trying to do. Plays well with our rolls. You know, you can get 10 through 19 pretty consistently, as long as we kind of start building up our our things that give us additional rolls. And the other benefit too, it's an instant speed spell, so we can make tokens at instant speed. We can also catch our opponent off guard if they're not expecting us to play an instant speed thing that's going to roll. So overall, pretty decent there. I threw in 2 copies of Serpentine Curve. It's a 4-mana sorcery. It's create a 0/0 green blue fractal creature token with X+1/+1 counters on it, where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery cards we own in our graveyard and exile. So it's another interesting card here that kind of works very well with the deck, just because a lot of what we're doing here, a lot of our roll-in things are spells, so we can definitely build up spells in our graveyard. So overall, pretty decent card. Getting a decent big creature out on the battlefield on turn 4 is not too bad. Though I would say this is kind of like that late game finisher as we kind of start playing more of our spells from our deck into the graveyard, and then we kind of play this and our opponent now has to deal with like a 7/7, 8/8, or even bigger creature. Another interesting card in the deck is the Delina Wild Mage. This is kind of like 4 of our rares that we're using. I do think this deck runs a 5th rare, but the 5th rare is more of like a fun card. You can always add it if you want to, but this is actually the true card that we really want to take advantage of, getting these additional rolls. So whenever it attacks, we have to choose target creature we control, and then we roll a d20. Rolls 1 through 14 create a tap attacking creature that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, and it has exiled this card at the end of combat. Rolls 15 through 20, we get to create those tokens. One of those tokens, you may roll again. So the idea here is you get this out, we get to swing into our opponent, for some damage. We get to then hopefully roll, get additional rolls, and try to get in that 15 to 20 range and target this creature. So what's going to happen here is, you're going to try to trigger this as many times, get a very large, legendary elf. You get an elf shaman out of it, you get multiple tokens out of it, and then if you already have your barbarian class in it and possibly rolled up to level 2, the goal here is now that you're creating all these tokens, you're now going to be able to put +2/+0 onto those tokens and essentially give them menace and +2/+0, which is going to make it hard for your opponent to block. So essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to overwhelm our opponent by catching them off guard by our Wild Mage. And the idea here is you probably want to play this after probably playing this at level 3, just so you can attack it immediately. Just because it's a 3/2, it can easily get targeted by some sort of removal or burn spell. That is kind of like the cool little trick with the deck. I mean, it's yet again, if you want, you can always take, make copies of other creatures in your deck, but I do say you want to use it on itself to create more copies of itself to therefore swing in for a bunch of damage. Next card up is Chaos Channeler. It's a 4-mana 4/3. Whenever it attacks, we have to roll a d20. We have to exile the top card of our library. We may play it this turn. 10 through 19, we can exile the top 2 cards of our library. We may play them this turn. And if we roll a nat 20, we get to reveal the top 3 cards of our library, and we get to play them this turn. So essentially, it's a pretty decent card that helps us dig a little bit deeper into our deck. I mean, each one of those effects is pretty good. You probably want to attack in with this first before you actually play like your land for the turn if you drew one or have one in hand. Just because you may reveal a land from the top of your library, and you get to play it from the exile, onto the battlefield. So overall, pretty decent card that has decent value. 4-mana 4/4/3 with this ability. It's not too terribly. Then we got the Farida Devil's Chosen. It's a 4-mana 3/3. It has Dark One's Own Luck. Whenever we roll one of our dice, Chosen gains Fly-In and Menace until end of turn. If any of those results were 10 or higher, we get to draw a card. So the benefit here is this is a card that helps us draw a little bit deeper into our deck every time we roll. Hopefully roll 10 or higher, we can draw, a card each time, I believe. So definitely pretty cool. Combine that with something like Delina Wild Mage, we can definitely stack up a decent amount of draws out of it. Overall, pretty decent card nonetheless. Now the last card in to make it kind of like that 5th rare is kind of a fun card, I do think. It's called Wizard Spellbook. It's a 7-mana artifact that we get to exile instant or sorcery card from our graveyard, and then we get to roll a d20. Activate only as a sorcery. 1 through 9, we get to copy that card, and we may cast that copy, so you just pay the cost of that spell. 10 through 19, we copy that card. We may cast the copy by paying 1 colorless rather than paying its mana cost, which is definitely pretty cool. The other thing, too, is with this card, it doesn't say your graveyard, so you can actually exile your opponent's spells and actually cast their spells against them, which is definitely also cool. And if we roll a nat 20, we have to copy each exiled card under Wizard Spellbook, and we can cast any number of those copies without paying their mana cost. So if we roll a nat 20, if we've stacked up a bunch of spells, we can just start popping off with all these spells, and our opponent's going to have to sit there and either take it or probably scoop at that point, just because, some players may play some really crazy spells on their end, and being able to cast their own spells against them may just make them, concede immediately right then and there. But overall, pretty decent card. It is a 1-of in the deck. I do think it's kind of one of those things when you do draw it, it's awesome. When you don't draw it, it's okay. I do think the rest of the deck can kind of keep up with its own. And sometimes this deck can really pop off. I had, as long as you roll 15 or higher with this, this deck can really keep on going and just catch your opponent off guard with a decent attack into them. And combining this with, Barbarian class at level 3, attacking immediately, they may swing all in, and then you swing back with a 3-2, and then all of a sudden attacking with 4 of these. Then you get all those menace triggers and +2/+0 triggers, and then they're dead on the return swing, which is overall pretty crazy. And they gotta, kind of probably hold back some blockers if they're expecting you to do something crazy like that. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. It is 10 islands, 9 mountains, 4 of the fjords, and 3 evolving wilds, just in case we need to fix our mana. There are a couple things in the deck that are double of their colors. So we have, we have 3 copies of the Channeler, which are 2 red, and we also have 1 Wizard Spellbook, which is double blue. Other than that, the rest of the deck is pretty 1 mana lean. It's either 1 red or 1 blue. So overall, pretty decent curve when it comes to everything. Yet again, it's a deck that really doesn't play a lot of big things. It just plays a lot of things that just hopefully trigger multiple triggers of their rolls, and it kind of finish off your opponent with triggers and that that strategy. Now, this next deck is actually a deck that I think I kind of briefly talked about when I kind of went over my preview, and it's mono Red Goblins. Now, Goblins is an interesting tribal style deck that's going to come out of Forgotten Realms. And I do think it's going to be one of those things that is going to be decently playable, and just some of the cards and what they do. But overall, for it being a budget deck, it's probably one of the better budget decks that I feel like I kind of consistently draw pretty decent with. And essentially, it's maybe not as strong as current mono red in current standard, but maybe it's a decent replacement if you're looking for something that's mono red-ish. It may not be as aggressive, but it does have some fun things you can do in the deck, and has various things that kind of help make the deck that much better. So the first thing we are playing in the deck is we are playing 2 copies of Barbarian class. Same thing here. We have a couple things that roll, but this is something that it's an additional benefit if we do draw it. Worst case scenario, if we don't draw it, we do have other things that can hopefully be aggressive against our opponent. After that, we have Fireblade Charger because it's Goblin Warrior for 1 mana. That when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. But you have things to pump it up. So, if it does die in an attack, we can maybe swing that damage that it would be pumped up into our opponent's face, or to another creature that may not die from combat. Frostbite, just because, yet again, if we're playing red and we're playing snow, might as well play Frostbite as a good spot removal spell. You have Goblin Javelineer. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with haste. Whenever it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to target creature blocking it. So if they're blocking it with a 2/2 or something like that, or even a 2/1, the minute it becomes block, the trigger happens, and you can actually, ping that, creature before they even block it, and maybe even save your Goblin Javelineer. Overall, pretty decent card. I do think for being 1 mana 1/1, that's a common. Then we have the Battlecry Goblin. It's a 2 mana 2/2 creature that with an ability that you can tap 2 mana. Goblins who control get +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. So if you maybe have this in open mana, you can actually pay the 2 mana immediately after playing it, pump up all your goblins, giving this creature haste, plus any other goblins that may have come onto the battlefield. And also has Pack Tactics ability that whenever it attacks, if you attack with creature's power 6 or greater this combat, create a 1/1 Red Goblin creature token that's tapped and also attacking. So overall, pretty decent card that gets, some more threats onto the battlefield. And I do think the idea with this deck, for the most part, the deck is on the cheaper end, with the spell cost. And the goal is to get as wide as possible, as quick as possible. So that is kind of why you see our lower end kind of full of a lot of cards. Then, of course, since it's the Goblin deck, I figured I also throw in the Goblin Morningstar. It's a 1 mana or 2 mana equipment that gives target creature +1/+0 and trample. We can equip it for 2 mana, 1 in a red, and we can, when it comes in the battlefield, we have to roll. We either get a 1/1 Red Goblin token that, and this comes onto the battlefield, or we get the 1/1 Red Goblin token with this equipped to that Goblin token. Either or kind of works. It's just a decent card that produces more additional goblins, which helps us become more of that Goblin tribal. Next card up is the Hobgoblin Captain. It's a 2 mana 3/1 with Pack Tactics. Whenever it attacks, if we attack creatures with power total 6 or greater, it actually gains first strike until end of turn. So overall, pretty decent card nonetheless as well. Maybe turn 1 and turn 2, you're not really going to have enough threats to really get 6 mana, but by turn 3, you could play a decent amount of threats and pump up your goblins enough so that you can get in on turn 3 with some pretty aggressive attacks that your opponent has to deal with, and this getting first strike is definitely pretty good overall. After that, we have another card called We See a Pair of Goblins. This is an interesting card here, as I do think there's the card that comes from the starter decks that's really only tied to best of 1. But this one is kind of similar in the sense that it can create 2 goblin creature tokens at instant speed. And the other benefits here as well, depending, what our size of our board is, maybe what our opponent has to block with, we can actually for 3 mana give all our creatures that may attack in with +2/+0 until end of turn, so we can attack even more aggressive, which is definitely awesome in that sense. So overall, it has a little bit of choice compared to, I think, the one that comes from the starter deck. Also, the one benefit of the one from the starter deck is that one, depending on how many you have in your graveyard, you get more effects based on that. So I guess you could choose, pick your own. I mean, depending on maybe what your situation is, if you may not have enough uncommon cards, you can at least have that as a temporary replacement. Though, if I feel like if you want to play something like this, you probably want this one instead, just because of, I think, its playability of playing one or the other, depending on the situation. Then we have our Goblin Lord, the Hobgoblin Bandit Lord. It's a 3 mana 2/3, and it gives all our other goblins +1/+1. And his effect is actually pretty interesting on what it's trying to do. For 1 red and tapping it, we can deal damage equal to the number of goblins that enter the battlefield under our control this turn to any target. So we can either ping our opponent's face, we can ping one of maybe their lone creature or their lone blocker for the damage before maybe even attacking. So it definitely has a good ability that, if our opponent is trying to be a little bit more on the defensive side, or maybe not, go all in with certain blockers, we can still at least ping them for, some damage to get that additional damage in, while also not attacking it with this and kind of protecting it in that way by tapping it down in order to ping our opponent's life in that sense. So overall, pretty decent Goblin Lord, and I do think this helps make goblins a little bit of a thing. And I probably want to make like a version of it in current standard that would be current standard until like September, and just kind of see how goblins feels when I have a little bit more cards to use, as I know there's some good cards from like M20 that would help out as well with this card. So overall, pretty decent goblin nonetheless. Then of course we have the Hulkin Bugbear. It's a 3 mana 3/3 goblin with haste. It's about it. I mean, it's just a 3 mana goblin with haste, nothing too crazy. It's pretty decent for the cost. I mean, a 3/3 haster for 3, not terrible. I know it's pretty vanilla, but combined with all our other goblins, this could technically be what we need on turn 3 to get some of our pack tactics to go off and attacking pretty aggressively against our opponent. If we have a Hobgoblin out, by the time this comes out, it comes in out as a 4/4, which is also very good. So it allows us to just attack him pretty aggressively. And, a 3/3 is pretty a decent threat, especially if you're on the play too. It can be something that, makes your opponent have to be very defensive on the blocks, or they could be dead the following turn. Now the last card up in the deck that is kind of like another card that helps us roll to kind of get us things, and this is the Swarming Goblins. It's a 5 mana creature that's a 4/3, and when it enters the battlefield, we get to roll a d20. Rolls 1 through 9, we get to create a red Goblin creature token. Rolls 10 through 19, we create 2 tokens, and rolls if we roll in that 20, we get to create three of those tokens. So depending on what we roll and combine that with something like Barbarian class, we could possibly get 3 tokens out of this, but I feel like getting 2 tokens for 5 mana plus a 4/3 is still pretty decent. I know there's probably some better cards that have come out in the past, but overall for its value and it being only a common, it's not that bad. Now you may be thinking to yourself, as we kind of gotten here, I've only have 2 Hobgoblins, whereas the other 2 rares that you normally would have in one of our budget decks. And the one thing I am messing around with, though I haven't really been able to really pull it off just yet, is the Den of the Bugbear. It's if we control 2 or more lands, it comes in the battlefield tapped. We can tap it, we can add a red mana. For 4 mana, we can, until end of turn, it becomes a 3/2 goblin creature token. With whenever this creature attacks, we get to put a 1/1 goblin creature token that's into play tapped and attack it as well. And it's still land. So overall, it's like a, it's like the one, creature land that we can play in the deck. That kind of feels pretty good. Just overall, synergizes well with our whole, goblin synergy. Though I could see, like, if you don't want to, you could always invest your rares into the Hobgoblin, just have 4 copies of it, as, it is, like, something you also want to draw, and it's not a legendary, so you can have multiple copies of it. So I do think it's one of those things, depending on how you feel and how you want to build it, or maybe you want to invest in your rares somewhere else in the deck. Overall, I do think the Goblin deck is another fun tribal deck that kind of feels pretty good, and in some of the games I do play, it is one of those things that it can win pretty quickly as long as your opponent's not really playing, the quickest deck on their end. Now, this last deck is a deck that I do think this is something that everyone wanted to kind of see and try out, and that is Adventure. It's the new mechanic where essentially, depending on what creature you play, it has like this ability that whenever whenever this creature comes in the battlefield, our attacks, we venture into a dungeon where we get to pick one of the 3 dungeons that we have access to. And essentially, depending on which room we go into, we get some sort of effect. Just in this example, you can see here, if our first room we enter in the dungeon, we actually would gain life. Room number 2, we would actually scry, and this is where we actually make a choice. We either go to the Goblin Bazaar, we could create a treasure token, or we go to the Twisted Caverns, and target creature can't attack until your next turn, which we can actually slow down our opponent if they're also attacking pretty aggressively, and so on and so forth until we get to the last layer and complete the dungeon. This card is pretty cool because it has a benefit of whenever we complete a dungeon, we get to give all our other creatures +1/+1, which is definitely very good, allows us attacking more aggressively. So overall, pretty decent card for 3 mana, and it helps us with our venture ability because it also happens when it enters and also attacks. So overall, pretty good card for 3 mana. Now, the rest of the deck is also very interesting, and I do think that there's a version of this deck that's out there that's either this, or it's Asban, or it's possibly even with a splash of blue. It depends on what your flavor wanted to do in, but because we are playing, budget, I didn't want to add in 3 colors just because it's hard to filter that mana, especially playing the 2022 queue where we don't have access to the pathways and things like that. So overall, this is kind of like the deck I'm going with, just on the idea of, maybe getting started out, and then depending on which cards you like from either color, you can choose which way you want to go that way. But overall, the deck is pretty straightforward. We start off with 4 copies of Portable Hole. It's a new artifact that we can play for white mana. When it enters the battlefield, we have to exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. Now, the one thing that's pretty cool about Portable Hole, it can target tokens as long as the token doesn't have a casting cost that's more than 2 or less. The other thing, too, is another thing, too, that people are playing is Treasure. You can actually, target their treasure token, and in response, they have to sacrifice it or they lose it. So it is one of those things that you can catch your opponent off guard if you do take one of their treasure tokens. It's something I have done, and I don't think our opponent was expecting it. So it is something that you can do if you need to, and like get rid of if they think you're gonna ramp. If you think they're gonna ramp something up, and use that treasure token to do so. We are playing 4 copies of Bloodchief's Thirst. I do think this is it feels okay. It doesn't feel great, but I do think it's one of those things that it's a pretty universal, removal spell. As we lost Heartless Act and Eliminate in Standard 2022, I do think it's a pretty decent removal spell, as we can always kick it up in the later game if we need to target something that's much bigger. But overall, 1 mana, sorcery removal spell that can target creature with mana value 2 or less. Overall, pretty decent spell nonetheless. Then we get the Dungeon Crawler. It's a 1 mana 2/1, and enters battlefield tap. But whenever we complete a dungeon, we can actually return it back from our graveyard to our hand. So it has this return effect that we can always add it back into the field if we need to. But overall, pretty interesting card. Though we do have to take the first turn off in order to play it. But overall, not too bad. Getting a 2/1 and swinging in on turn 2 is not that bad, and then playing whatever your turn 2 is. Overall, pretty decent kind of turn. Now, another card I'm messing around with that I do think is actually pretty decent, and I do think catches people off guard because they're not expecting it, is this card, Feign Death. It's a 1 mana instant spell that until end of turn, target creature gains whenever this creature dies, return to the battlefield, tapped under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So overall, pretty decent card. And it's one of those things that you could swing in, and your opponent's like, why are they swinging in? I could block in exchange. Well, you may take one of their creatures, but then in return, you actually get another creature back. So overall, pretty decent exchange there. And we do have a few things in the deck that, if we re-trigger them, we do get like the re-trigger of their venture. So it is something that you can do in that sense to either protect or even get a re-trigger of something if you want to swing in and try to re-trigger a venture trigger to then get the next ability of the next room that you're going through. Another card we have in the deck is Lightfoot Rogue. It's a 2 mana 2/1 with the ability called Sneak Attack. Whenever it attacks, we get to roll a d20. Rolls 1 through 9, it gains Death Touch on turn. Rolls 10 through 19, it gets +1/+0 in Death Touch. And Nat 20 would get +3/+0 for Strike and Death Touch at end of turn. So overall, pretty decent creature at turn 2 that can attack in pretty aggressively. And if our opponent can't really, your opponent eventually has to block it, and it has Death Touch. And it can get, it can get additional +1/+0 and also eventually First Strike, which can be pretty good. But overall, a pretty decent card that can attack in aggressively, and at some point your opponent has to block it. And with it having Death Touch, if their creature doesn't have any sort of First Strike or any way to hit it first, this thing can take out a much bigger creature. Another card in the deck is Power Word Kill. We have 4 copies of. We have to destroy target non-angel, non-demon, non-devil, non-dragon creature. It's an interesting removal spell in the sense that it can't target those specific things. Though I have only run up against, a dragon deck. I haven't really run up against a deck that plays the other 3 very heavily. Though I could see, something like Orzhov Angels pop up, and then you can't target any of their angels. So it is one of those interesting removal spells that you can play. But if your opponent plays any of those things that are there, you then can't remove that particular thing. And I do think that's why we kind of play Bloodchief's Thirst as our other removal spell. But overall, pretty interesting, 2 mana removal spell that I guess we'll see how it plays out as, the meta kind of develops overall. Now, the first card we have up in our deck is the Triumphant Adventurer. It's a 2 mana, 1 white and 1 black creature with, it's a 1/1 with Death Touch. And as long as it's our turn, it actually gains First Strike. And whenever it attacks, we get to venture into a dungeon. So essentially, we get to start a dungeon on turn 2 if need be, which is definitely very good. And when it's our turn and we attack in, it has first strike. So now we're also going to be hitting our opponent's creature regardless of, you know, if it's bigger than us first, unless it has first strike itself. We're a pretty decent creature. And the goal is we kind of want to complete a dungeon as quickly as possible. I do think the goal here is you want to take the dungeon that has the least amount of rooms, just because you want to get through your first one to then get the benefit of things that have the ability or have, you know, triggers based on if you complete a dungeon or not. And this will definitely be one of those cards that helps us get there. After that, we have the Cloister Gargoyle. It's a 3-mana 0/4, which doesn't seem too crazy, but whenever it enters the battlefield, we get to actually venture into a dungeon, which is definitely awesome for the deck. And then as long as we complete a dungeon, it gets +3/+0 and also flying. So essentially, once you completed your first dungeon, it will gain flying. It also gains +3/+0, and now becomes a pretty decent blocker in the air. And we can also swing it in through the air, which is also, you know, pretty good as well. And the other thing too about it is kind of one of those things. 0/4 is still a pretty decent blocker as long as they don't have some sort of crazy creature that can, you know, attack in through it. The 0/4 can pretty much chump a lot of your smaller creatures. So overall, pretty decent blocker regardless of it being pumped up or not. I already kind of went over Nadar, but you know, he's a selfless paladin for 3 mana. It's a 3/3 vigilance. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, we get to venture into our dungeon. And then whenever we completed a dungeon, he actually gives all our creatures that Anthem effect of +1/+1, which definitely makes us attack him more aggressively. And you know, at some point when you start getting your other creatures that trigger dungeon triggers, it definitely helps us get through dungeons much quicker. So overall, pretty decent card. He is probably a card you want to, you know, get more copies of, just because, you know, this is something we kind of want to hit, just because of his ability of doing it either entering or even attacking. So overall, pretty good card right then and there. Then the last card we have up is Barrowin, the Clan Under. He's a 4-mana 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, we get to venture into our dungeon. And whenever he attacks, return up to a creature card with mana value cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield if we completed a dungeon. So in an awesome way, if we play him after and we get to attack in with him, he's a good way for us to get something back from our graveyard back onto the battlefield. So he can get back our Nadar, he can get back our Gargoyle, he can get back one of our small creatures. Just an overall good way for us to kind of resurrect creatures back from our graveyard without actually having to pay for them. And other than him, all our other creatures in the deck cost 3 or less. So overall, pretty decent card to kind of help us out. And now for the mana base, it's pretty straightforward. We have 9 plains, 11 swamps, 3 of the campuses, and 2 of the Evolving Wild, or 2 of the campuses, 2 of the Evolving Wild. So overall, pretty you know, low curve yet again. I do think we do play 24 lands, but we do play a pretty low curve. You know, we don't need to play any more lands for the most part. We could even possibly think about cutting lands, just because I do think, you know, 4 is really our top end. Though it is kind of beneficial if you are able to play multiple things on the same turn. But overall, the deck is pretty good, and I do think once you know, maybe have some wild cards and maybe you do like the venture mechanic, I do think this is maybe the idea, thinking, do we want to add in another color? Because there are some good cards in blue and green that could also make the deck run even more efficiently. Though I would say that with that, you want to have the rares available to kind of add in the, you know, the pathways and stuff like that to help build your mana even more, because playing a bunch of tap lanes kind of will slow you down a lot, and you know, then at that point you may get overrun by your opponent. But overall, this deck is pretty decent. Now, with that being said, I mean, these are some budget decks, and I do think this is one of those things that I'll probably tweak, and I'll probably, you know, see what other things I can build throughout the weekend and whatnot. And I'll probably do some gameplay for each one of these decks, as well as, you know, next week I am moving at the time of recording. I am moving, so I probably will have to do some batch recording of some videos. So I'll probably do a lot of gameplay videos of these decks. So if you want to see some gameplay, you can check them out on the channel by hitting the subscribe button. But if you like the video, hit that like button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next Magic the Gathering video. Just wanted to give a special shout out to all the channel members. You can also become a channel member yourself if you want to go down below and either click the join button next to the subscribe button and or click the link in the description. It does help out the channel by you clicking that join button. But until next time, I'll see you later.